There's a particular kind of quiet anxiety that lives in your chest when you know you should have money left over, but somehow you don't. You did the math at the beginning of the month, you told yourself this time would be different, you felt that small surge of optimism, that clean slate energy of a new month, a fresh start, a version of yourself who finally has it together, the kind of person who checks her balance without flinching, who knows exactly what's coming in and what's going out, and still has something left at the end. And you meant it, you really did. It wasn't wishful thinking, it was a genuine intention. And then the weeks passed quietly and normally, and somehow by the 25th you're watching your account balance like it personally offended you, wondering where it all went, retracing the month in your head like a detective trying to solve a mystery that keeps ending the same way. And if that feels familiar, if that particular combination of confusion and low-grade shame resonates somewhere in your chest, I want you to stay with me. Because my name is Liana and I've spent more time than I'd like to admit thinking about why smart, capable, genuinely responsible women still feel financially unstable, not because they're reckless, not because they don't care, not because they're making dramatic irresponsible choices, but because nobody ever gave them a system that actually fits the way real humans live, and that gap, that space between knowing you should budget and actually being able to sustain one, is exactly what I want to talk about today. Because here's what I've noticed, and I say this having talked to a lot of women about money, not in a formal research kind of way, but in the way that happens when you start being honest about your own financial anxiety and suddenly everyone around you starts being honest too. Most of us are not failing at budgeting because we lack discipline or intelligence or care, we are failing at budgeting because the systems we were handed were never designed for us. They were designed for a very specific type of person, a person who finds tracking inherently satisfying, who experiences logging a transaction as a small win rather than a small punishment, who looks at a spreadsheet full of categorized expenses and feels pride rather than dread. And if that's you, genuinely, if you are that person, then so much of the traditional budgeting advice out there will work beautifully for you. But for the rest of us, for the overwhelming majority of people who find detailed daily tracking genuinely exhausting and emotionally draining, that kind of system doesn't just fail to help, it actively makes things worse. And I think it's really important to understand why, not to excuse ourselves from the work of managing money, but to understand what we're actually up against. Because understanding the real problem is the only way to find a solution that actually holds. So here's the thing, you've tried, I know you have. And I'm not saying that in a patronizing way, I'm saying it because it's almost universally true. Almost every woman I've talked to who feels stuck with money has tried. She downloaded the app, she set up the categories with that brief intoxicating feeling of organization, she input her first few transactions with genuine enthusiasm, she felt briefly and beautifully on top of it, like she was finally becoming the person she wanted to be. Financially organized, clear-eyed, intentional. And then life happened, not dramatically, not catastrophically, just normally, a busy week where she didn't have time to log things, a purchase that didn't fit neatly into any of the categories, a moment where she sat down to do her tracking and looked at the numbers and felt something close to shame, something close to being scolded, and she closed the app, and she told herself she'd get back to it tomorrow, and tomorrow became next week, and next week became never, and now it sits on her phone quietly, judging her every time she scrolls past it, and she's back to the vague financial anxiety, the fuzzy uncomfortable relationship with her own bank account, the feeling of being someone who can't get it together. And I need you to hear this as clearly as I can possibly say it, that is not a discipline problem, and it is not a character flaw, that is a system problem, full stop. The reason this matters so much is that most financial advice treats the failure to stick with a budgeting system as evidence that the person needs more discipline, more commitment, more willpower, and so the advice is always some version of try harder, care more, be more consistent. And I understand why that advice gets given, because from the outside, a person who downloads an app and then stops using it looks like someone who gave up, but that framing completely misses what's actually happening psychologically. Because what's actually happening is this: every time you sit down to track your spending and you see it laid out in front of you, the impulse purchases, the subscriptions you forgot you were still paying for, the takeout that seemed fine in the moment but added up to a number that makes your stomach drop, you don't feel motivated to do better, you feel embarrassed, genuinely uncomfortable, you feel like you're being evaluated and found lacking, and the brain, being the extraordinarily clever, deeply self-protective organ that it is, registers that experience, and it begins to associate the act of budgeting with that feeling, with that particular flavor of discomfort and shame, and once that association is established, the brain does exactly what it's designed to do, which is to protect you from repeated painful experiences, and it does that through avoidance. You start finding reasons not to open the app, not to look at the account, not to engage with your finances at all, not because you don't care but because somewhere below the level of conscious decision-making, your brain has learned that looking at your money feels bad, and it is steering you away from that experience the same way it would steer you away from touching a hot stove, and no amount of willpower or discipline sustainably overrides that kind of deeply embedded emotional avoidance, which is why any system that is going to actually work long-term, that is going to actually stick, has to account for both of those realities, the need for minimal friction and effort, and the need for emotional safety. Because a system that makes you feel terrible every time you use it is not a system you will use, regardless of how theoretically correct it is. And this is where I want to offer you a completely different way of thinking about what budgeting actually is, because I think the word itself has become so loaded with connotations of restriction and deprivation and self-denial that it's almost impossible to approach it neutrally, so I want to set that word aside for a moment and talk instead about information, because that's really what we're after, just information, just an honest, clear picture of what's actually happening with your money. And the reason that picture matters is not so that you can punish yourself for your choices but so that you can make better ones going forward, and there's a model that I find really useful here, which is the way that every single successful business, from a tiny independent coffee shop to a multinational corporation, understands its own financial reality, and that model is called a profit and loss statement, a P&L, and it is almost comically simple in its structure. At the very top, every source of money coming in, all your revenue, all your income, everything that flows toward you, add it all up and that's your total revenue, and then below that, every expense, everything that flows away from you, all your costs, and you add those up too, and then you subtract your total expenses from your total revenue, and the number you're left with is either a profit or a loss. You either kept more than you spent or you spent more than you kept, and that number at the bottom is one of the most important numbers in the entire business, because it tells you with complete honesty whether the business is viable, whether it's sustainable, whether it's building towards something or quietly eroding. And I want you to understand that your personal finances work in exactly the same way. Money comes in, money goes out, and the difference between those two numbers is either building your future or quietly dismantling it, and most people, genuinely, truly, most people, have no real clear picture of that difference. They know roughly what they earn, they have a vague sense of their biggest expenses, but the full honest picture stays soft and fuzzy and uncomfortable, and fuzzy is precisely where financial stress lives. Because when you can't see your situation clearly you can't make clear decisions, you're just guessing, hoping, avoiding, and the anxiety that comes from not knowing is often worse than whatever the actual numbers turn out to be. So here is how the system I want to share with you actually works, and I want you to notice how different it feels from what you've probably tried before, because the first and most important thing I want to tell you is that this is a monthly practice, not a daily one, not a real-time one, not something you do every time you buy a coffee or a piece of clothing or a meal. Just once a month, you sit down, you create a simple honest snapshot of the previous month, and that's it, that's the whole core of it. And I think when I say that out loud some part of you probably relaxes a little, because the daily tracking, the constant logging, the real-time categorization, that's the part that breaks most people, that's the friction that creates the shame spiral that leads to abandonment, and we're removing it entirely, we're replacing it with one intentional monthly session that gives you the same quality of information without the daily psychological burden. And here's how that session actually looks. You start at the top, just like the P&L, you list every single source of income from the previous month, your salary after tax if you're employed, any freelance or contract work, any side income, any other money that came in, add it all up, that's your revenue for the month. And then below that you move into expenses, and I like to think of these in two broad categories, fixed and variable. Your fixed expenses are the ones that don't really change month to month, rent or mortgage, utilities, insurance, your phone bill, transportation costs if they're consistent, healthcare, minimum payments on any debt. These are the non-negotiables, the floor of your spending. Add those up, and then your variable expenses are everything that involves some degree of choice: groceries, restaurants and takeout, coffee, clothing and shopping, entertainment, subscriptions you actually use, personal care, gifts, travel, everything that fluctuates based on your decisions and your life that month. Add those up too. Add your fixed and variable expenses together to get your total expenses, subtract that from your income, and the number at the bottom is your personal profit or loss for the month. It is that simple, and I know it sounds almost too simple, like there must be something more complex required for it to actually work, but I promise you the simplicity is the point. The simplicity is what makes it sustainable. The simplicity is what allows you to actually do it month after month instead of abandoning it by week 3. What happens when you do this consistently, when you create this honest snapshot every single month, is genuinely remarkable, and I want to describe it carefully because I think it's one of the most underappreciated aspects of financial awareness. Patterns emerge, patterns that were completely invisible before, that were hidden inside the fog of day-to-day spending, and those patterns are often surprising. Not always in a bad way. Sometimes you discover that you're actually spending less than you thought in certain areas. Sometimes you find subscriptions you completely forgot about that have been quietly draining money for months. Sometimes you realize that a category you told yourself was a small expense is actually one of your biggest ones. And seeing those patterns clearly, without judgment, just as data, is one of the most clarifying experiences you can have with your own financial life. Because you stop operating on assumptions and approximations and you start operating on actual knowledge. You stop saying, I think I spend about this much on restaurants, and you start saying, I know exactly what I spent on restaurants last month and I can decide how I feel about that. And that shift from vague guessing to clear knowing is where real financial agency begins. Because you cannot direct something you cannot see, and this monthly snapshot gives you consistent, reliable visibility into your own financial reality. Now, alongside this monthly practice, there's a second component that I think of as the weekly maintenance layer, and this one is even lighter. It's 10 minutes, genuinely 10 minutes, once a week, and the purpose of it is not deep analysis or extensive review, it's just to keep you connected to your financial reality in a way that feels easy and non-threatening rather than heavy and burdensome. And I want to be specific about how I'd encourage you to approach it, because the environment matters more than you might think. Pick a time that has some natural ease in it. A Sunday morning works well for a lot of people. Make yourself something you enjoy, good coffee or tea, sit somewhere comfortable, and treat this 10 minutes as something you're doing for yourself rather than something you owe some external authority, because that framing shift changes the emotional texture of the whole experience. And what you actually do in those 10 minutes is 3 things. First, you look at your balances: checking account, savings account, credit cards. Just the numbers, no judgment, no story, just information. 2 minutes. Second, you think briefly about any upcoming expenses for the coming week, anything larger than usual, any bills due, any events that might cost money, so that nothing catches you completely off guard. 2 minutes. And third, you do a quick scan of recent transactions just to make sure everything looks right, nothing unusual, no charges you don't recognize. 5 minutes. And then you're done, you close everything, you go about your Sunday. And what this weekly 10 minutes does over time is keep you in a relationship with your money instead of an avoidance of it. It keeps the picture from going completely fuzzy between your monthly reviews. It maintains a baseline level of awareness that makes the monthly session easier and less emotionally loaded because you've been gently touching in, rather than completely disconnecting and then having to face everything at once. And underneath both of these practices, the monthly snapshot and the weekly check-in, the real skill that you're actually building is something that I think is far more valuable than any specific financial technique, and that is emotional neutrality toward your own numbers, the ability to look at your financial reality with the same calm detachment that a scientist brings to data, to see the numbers as information rather than as a verdict on your worth or your intelligence or your discipline. Because one of the most damaging things about the way most of us were taught to relate to money is that we learned to treat our bank balance as a moral score. A high balance means you're doing well, means you're responsible and capable and together, and a low balance means you're failing, means you're careless or lazy or not enough, and that moral framing makes every financial review feel like a judgment, like an evaluation, and that's exactly why looking at your numbers becomes something you dread and avoid rather than something you can do with ease. And what I want for you is to completely dismantle that framing, to replace it with something much more useful, which is simple curiosity. When you look at your monthly numbers and you see something that surprises you, instead of feeling shame, I want you to get curious. Where did that come from? What was happening that month? What does that tell me about my patterns? What would I want to do differently? And that shift from shame to curiosity is not just a nicer way to feel about your finances, it's actually a more effective one. Because shame closes you down, it makes you want to look away, and curiosity opens you up, it makes you want to understand. And understanding is what changes behavior over time, not punishment, not restriction, not the grinding willpower of white-knuckling through a system that makes you miserable. Once you've been doing this for a couple of months, once your monthly P&L starts to become familiar territory and the emotional charge around it starts to fade, you'll likely begin to see a surplus, some positive number at the bottom of your monthly snapshot. And I want to give you a very clear and very simple framework for what to do with that surplus. Because this is another place where decision fatigue can derail even the most financially aware person. When you suddenly have extra money and you're not sure what to do with it, the easiest thing is to let it just disappear into vague spending, which is exactly what we're trying to avoid. So here is the priority order, and I'd encourage you to just commit to it without overthinking it, because the value of having a predetermined order is precisely that you don't have to make the decision fresh every single time. The first priority is your emergency fund. And this is non-negotiable. It is the foundation that everything else rests on. Because without it, any unexpected expense, a car repair, a medical bill, a sudden job change, becomes a financial crisis that unravels all your other progress. The goal is 3 to 6 months of your essential expenses held in a separate high-yield savings account, somewhere accessible but not so accessible that you dip into it casually. And until you have that foundation in place, it should be where every dollar of surplus goes. The second priority, once your emergency fund is established, is any high-interest debt you're carrying, typically credit card debt or personal loans with high interest rates. And the reason this comes before investing is mathematical. If you're paying 18 or 20 or 25% interest on debt, paying that debt down is effectively a guaranteed return of 18 or 20 or 25%, which is a better return than almost any investment you could make. So eliminating high-interest debt is one of the highest return financial moves available to you. Regardless of how unsexy it sounds, the third priority is retirement investing, contributing consistently to whatever retirement account is available to you. And the reason consistency matters here more than amount is that time in the market is one of the most powerful forces in personal finance. A small amount invested consistently over many years will almost always outperform a larger amount invested sporadically. So start where you can and increase over time. And then the fourth priority is everything else, all the other goals and experiences and things you're saving toward, the vacation, the down payment, the course you want to take, the life you're actually building. And this order isn't arbitrary, it's designed to build financial resilience from the ground up, foundation first, then debt elimination, then future security, then everything else, and following it removes the need to make the same decision repeatedly, which is a form of financial peace in itself. Because I want to come back to that word, peace, because I think it's the word that actually matters here, and it's the one that gets left out of almost every conversation about personal finance, which tends to focus on optimization and returns and strategies and systems, all of which are useful, but which miss the point if we're being honest about what most of us are actually after. And what most of us are actually after is peace. The ability to exist in our own lives without money being a constant background hum of anxiety, without the low-grade stress that comes from not knowing where you stand, without the avoidance and the shame and the feeling of being slightly out of control of your own life. And what I want you to understand is that the practices I've described, the monthly snapshot, the weekly 10 minutes, the clear priority order for your surplus, they're not ends in themselves, they're the means to that peace. They're the infrastructure that makes it possible to stop worrying, to stop avoiding, to stop feeling vaguely behind or vaguely wrong about money, and start feeling genuinely calm and clear and capable instead. And that calm looks different for different people, which is something I want to acknowledge, because the vision of financial success that gets held up as universal is often very specific. It's a certain net worth, a certain kind of investment portfolio, a certain age at which you retire. And while those things are fine goals if they resonate with you, they're not the only definition of financial success. And for a lot of women I've talked to, the version of financial peace they're actually working toward is something quieter and more personal, For some it looks like security, the simple deep comfort of knowing that if something unexpected happens, a job loss, a health issue, an emergency, she won't be financially devastated, she has a buffer, she has options, she has time to figure it out without everything falling apart. For others it looks like freedom, the ability to leave a job that's making her miserable without panicking about money, the ability to say yes to an opportunity that excites her without the fear that she can't afford to take the risk. For others still it looks like softness, having enough breathing room in her finances that life doesn't feel like a constant scramble, that she can spend money on something that matters to her without guilt, that she can be generous with people she loves without stress, and whatever version of that peace is true for you, that is the real reason to do this work, not some abstract notion of financial responsibility, not a performance of having it together for other people to see. Just your own specific version of a life where money works for you rather than against you, where you are in relationship with your finances rather than in avoidance of them, where the story your money is telling about your life is one you actually chose. Because your money is always telling a story, right now, whether you're looking at it or not, whether you're tracking it or not, whether you feel ready to face it or not, it is telling a story about how you live and what you value and what you're building and what you're not building yet. And the only question is whether you're reading that story with your own hand on the pen, actively shaping where it goes, or whether you're letting it be written by default, by habit, by avoidance, by the quiet drift of days passing without intention. And this system, this simple, low-friction, emotionally safe system, is just a way of picking up the pen, of saying I want to know what's happening, I want to see it clearly, I want to make choices that reflect what I actually care about, and I want to feel calm while I do it. And that is not too much to ask, that is not an unrealistic standard. That is exactly what good financial management looks like when it's stripped of all the shame and the complexity and the performance, just clarity, just intention, just the quiet enduring confidence of someone who knows where she stands and is choosing deliberately from there, and that is entirely, completely, absolutely available to you.